Camilla's name is suddenly being whispered inside palace walls, and not in a way the royal family can control. Staff who were never meant to speak are now describing a private moment so unsettling it allegedly left Catherine visibly shaken. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a rumor that started online. According to those who were there, something happened behind closed doors that changed how Catherine sees the monarchy forever. What makes this different is the timing. Catherine wasn't at her strongest. She was dealing with one of the most fragile periods of her life, and insiders say that's exactly when a routine meeting took a turn no one expected. Voices were raised, boundaries were crossed, and when Catherine walked out, staff immediately knew something had gone very wrong. The palace acted fast. Silence was enforced. Witnesses were moved, and the story was buried before it ever reached the public. But now, years of quiet tension, resentment, and power struggles are being pulled into the light by people who say they couldn't stay silent anymore. Because this wasn't just about hurt feelings, it was about control, hierarchy, and what happens when the future of the monarchy feels threatened. And once you hear what insiders claim was said in that room, it becomes clear why the palace never wanted this story told. For years, the tension between Queen Camilla and Catherine, Princess of Wales, has been carefully disguised behind smiles, coordinated outfits, and perfectly timed appearances. To the public, everything looked stable, respectful, controlled. But insiders say the reality was far more fragile. Long before that private meeting, there were signs that something beneath the surface was slowly unraveling. Those who worked closest to the family say Camilla had grown, increasingly sensitive to how the spotlight shifted in recent years. Catherine's presence wasn't loud or forceful, but it didn't need to be. Her popularity spoke for itself. Every appearance drew warmth. Every absence sparked concern. And while Catherine never openly sought that attention, reports suggest it quietly became a point of tension. Not because of anything Catherine did, but because of what she represented, the future, and everything that came with it. As Catherine's role expanded, so did the contrast. She embodied stability at a time when the monarchy desperately needed it. Younger audiences connected with her, older generations respected her restraint. And according to palace observers, that growing influence created unease in places few people ever see. It wasn't explosive. It was subtle. The kind of discomfort that doesn't erupt until pressure finds the right moment. That moment came when Catherine was least prepared for it. Insiders say her health struggles didn't just weaken her physically. They stripped away the emotional armor she'd relied on for years. She was still showing up, still fulfilling duties, still protecting her children from the noise. But privately, she was exhausted. And when that scheduled meeting was added to her calendar, no one expected it to become anything more than a formality. Inside the room, the balance shifted quickly. Sources say Camilla's frustration held back for years finally surfaced. What was meant to be professional reportedly turned personal. Media coverage was mentioned. Perceived favoritism was raised. And then, according to staff accounts, comments crossed into territory that stunned everyone who later learned what had been said. Not because they were loud, but because of when they were delivered. Catherine, already drained, was not in a position to defend herself. Witnesses describe her trying to de-escalate, attempting to keep the exchange respectful, but the tone didn't soften. And when she finally left, it was clear this wasn't something she could simply brush off. Her reaction wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. And that's what unsettled staff the most. Word reached Prince William quickly. According to reports, his response was immediate and fierce. He had seen Catherine endure pressure without complaint for years. And this, insiders say, felt like a line that should never have been crossed. Conversations followed that were tense, controlled, and deeply personal. Not arguments meant to leak, but ones that changed how trust operated inside the family. At the center of it all sat King Charles III, caught between loyalty and legacy. The institution demanded silence. The family demanded resolution. And the choice that followed revealed exactly how the palace handles moments it can't afford to explain. The response wasn't accountability. It was containment. Staff were reminded where they stood. Schedules were adjusted. Distance was created where proximity once existed. No statements, no acknowledgement, just an unspoken agreement that this would never reach daylight. But silence has a way of cracking when people believe something deeply unfair. has been allowed to stand. And that's why this story didn't end behind that closed door. Because what insiders are now describing isn't just a single confrontation, it's a pattern. Years of quiet competition, subtle remarks, power dynamics that rarely surface until vulnerability exposes them. And once that line was crossed, nothing inside the palace felt the same again, because when trust breaks at the top, the damage doesn't stay contained. And what happened next would force Catherine to rethink not just her place in the family, but how much protection the institution she serves is truly willing to give. In the days that followed, Catherine didn't retreat. She did what she's always done. She carried on. Publicly, nothing appeared different. Her posture was composed, her expressions controlled, her presence calm. But behind the scenes, those closest to her noticed a shift, not weakness, but caution. A new awareness that something fundamental had changed. The belief that loyalty would always be reciprocated had taken a quiet but irreversible hit. What hurt most, according to people in her inner circle, wasn't just what was allegedly said in that room. It was what came after. No apology, no acknowledgement, no real attempt to make things right. Instead, the palace moved into protection mode. Not for the person who was hurt, but for the image that might be damaged if the truth surfaced. Catherine was expected to absorb it and move on, the same way so many before her had been expected to do. This wasn't lost on staff. Some of them had worked in royal households for decades. They understood discretion. They understood hierarchy. But they also understood when something crossed a moral line. Watching Catherine quietly shoulder the emotional weight while the system closed ranks around silence left many deeply unsettled. To them, this wasn't just family drama. It was a failure of the institution's duty of care. Privately, Catherine began tightening her circle. Fewer confidants, fewer moments of unguarded openness. Friends say she became more strategic, more aware of how exposed vulnerability can be inside an environment built on optics. She still believed in the monarchy. She still believed in her role. But she no longer assumed the system would protect her simply because she had done everything right. William, meanwhile, didn't forget. Sources suggest his trust was shaken just as deeply, not only in the moment itself, but in how it was handled. He had always understood the pressures of the crown, but this exposed a reality he couldn't ignore. That protecting his family might sometimes mean standing apart from the very institution he is destined to lead. As the year moved toward its end, the distance became visible to those who knew where to look. Interactions were polite but minimal. Events were carefully managed. Staff choreographed movements with surgical precision to avoid unscripted moments. To the public, it looked like business as usual. Inside, it felt like walking through a house where the walls had shifted, just enough to make everything feel unfamiliar. And this is where the story stops being just about two women. Because what insiders are really questioning now is whether the monarchy can survive without changing. How it treats the people who carry it forward. Catherine represents stability, empathy, and connection in a world that increasingly demands those qualities. If someone like her can be left unprotected when she needs it most, it raises uncomfortable questions no amount of tradition can silence. That's why these accounts are emerging now. Not to tear anything down, but because silence stopped feeling like loyalty. And once that line was crossed, keeping quiet no longer felt like the right thing to do. Because this wasn't just a moment of conflict. It was a warning. And what the palace chooses to do next may decide not only Catherine's future, but the future of the monarchy itself. What makes this moment especially dangerous for the palace is that it didn't leak through tabloids or outsiders. It came from inside. From people who had spent years protecting the institution at all costs. These were not reckless voices looking for attention. They were measured, conflicted, and, by their own accounts, pushed to speak only after realizing nothing was ever going to change. Several insiders say the biggest turning point wasn't the confrontation itself, but the realization that it would be treated as if it never happened, no follow-up, no boundaries established. Just an expectation that everyone would fall back into formation. For staff who had watched Catherine give everything to her role, that silence felt less like discretion and more like erasure. Behind closed doors, the future began to be discussed differently. Not publicly, not officially, but in quiet conversations where loyalty used to be automatic, people started asking whether the system still understood the difference between authority and accountability. This shift hasn't gone unnoticed. Public affection for her hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown stronger. People sense authenticity, even when they don't know the details. And that's what makes the situation so volatile. The monarchy's future depends heavily on figures who feel relatable, protected, and respected. When those figures appear isolated within their own institution, public trust doesn't disappear overnight, but it starts asking questions. The palace now faces a quiet reckoning. It can continue doing what it has always done, relying on silence and tradition to smooth over fractures. Or it can acknowledge that the world has changed and that loyalty can no longer be demanded without care being returned. Staff speaking out isn't rebellion. It's a signal that the old methods are no longer holding. Because at the center of all this isn't scandal. It's something far more uncomfortable. A realization that strength doesn't mean enduring everything in silence, and that even the most polished institutions can fail the people holding them together. The story isn't finished. Not yet. But one thing is clear to those watching closely. Whatever happened behind those doors didn't just leave someone hurt. It exposed a fault line the monarchy can no longer pretend isn't there. And now that fault line is shaping every decision moving forward. Palace insiders say nothing is handled casually anymore when it comes to Catherine's schedule, her proximity to certain family members, or the environments she's placed in. What once relied on trust now relies on structure. Meetings are shorter, interactions are mediated, and nothing is left to chance. These changes aren't announced, but they're felt by everyone working behind the scenes. There's also a growing awareness that this moment can't be undone. Even if apologies were offered tomorrow, the damage has already altered how relationships function. Trust, once broken, doesn't snap back into place. It reshapes behavior. And that's exactly what staff say they're witnessing. A quieter Catherine, a more guarded William, and a palace that seems unsure whether holding the line is still enough. What's striking is how little this has to do with public drama. No interviews. No leaks designed to inflame headlines. Just a slow, steady emergence of accounts. Something deeply personal was mishandled in a system that prioritizes control over care. And once people inside recognized that pattern, staying silent began to feel like complicity. This is why the situation matters beyond royal intrigue. The monarchy has always asked its members to sacrifice privacy, comfort, and sometimes happiness for the greater good. But modern audiences expect something in return. Respect, protection, basic humanity. When those expectations aren't met, even the most loyal institutions begin to lose their footing. Catherine's role going forward will likely define how this chapter is remembered, not because she's making demands, but because of the standards she quietly represents. Calm under pressure, strength without cruelty, and an understanding that leadership isn't about dominance. Whether the palace rises to meet that standard remains to be seen. For now, what's clear is this. The silence that once protected everything is no longer airtight. The people who believed in it the most are the ones questioning it. And once that happens, the story stops being about one confrontation and starts being about whether the monarchy can evolve without losing the very figures who keep it relevant. Because when the future feels unsupported, it doesn't rebel. It withdraws, and that may be the most dangerous outcome of all. What happens next may not be loud, but it will be lasting. Insiders say the most significant change isn't in public appearances, but in long-term planning. Catherine is said to be thinking further ahead than ever before, not just about her role, but about the environment she and William will eventually inherit. The question is no longer how to endure the system, but how to shape it so the same mistakes aren't repeated when the crown changes hands. Within palace circles, there's a growing recognition that this moment exposed a weakness no amount of ceremony can disguise. Institutions survive on trust, and trust doesn't come from silence alone. It comes from fairness. From knowing that when someone is hurt, they won't be asked to carry it alone for the sake of appearances. Staff who've spoken out say they did so because they feared that without accountability, the same dynamics would continue unchecked. For Camilla, the situation has reportedly narrowed her world. Appearances remain formal, duties continue, but the space around her has tightened. Fewer unscripted moments, fewer private interactions. Not as punishment, but as precaution. The palace understands now that perception matters, and any further friction would be impossible to contain. What was once dismissed as internal tension is now treated as a risk. William's position has also hardened. Sources say he's clearer than ever about where his priorities lie. His loyalty to the institution remains, but it no longer outweighs his responsibility to protect his family. That balance, once assumed to be automatic, is now deliberate, and that shift alone signals how deeply this moment has landed. What's striking is how Catherine has chosen not to center herself in the narrative. She hasn't allowed this to define her publicly. Instead, she's doubled down on the qualities that earned trust in the first place: consistency, empathy, and restraint. Those around her say that restraint isn't weakness, it's calculation, a recognition that lasting change often happens quietly, long before it's visible. As time passes, the monarchy will face a choice it can't delay forever. Continue relying on old methods that demand silence at any cost, or adapt to a reality where respect and accountability are no longer optional. This moment forced that question into the open, whether the palace wanted it there or not, because the truth is, scandals fade. Headlines move on, but the way people are treated when no one is watching stays with them. And in this case, it may end up shaping the future of the crown more than any public controversy ever could. And this is where the story takes an even quieter, more unsettling turn. Insiders say the palace isn't worried about what the public knows. It's worried about what people inside now understand. Once staff begin to question whether silence equals loyalty, the foundation shifts. The monarchy has survived scandals before, but it has never been forced to confront internal doubt at this level. Several former aides describe a noticeable change in morale. Not dramatic resignations or open defiance, but hesitation. A pause before enforcing rules that once felt unquestionable. When people start asking themselves who the system protects and who it doesn't, the culture begins to change whether leadership wants it to or not. That's the part the palace can't manage with press briefings or careful scheduling. Catherine is aware of this. According to those close to her, she knows that her response is being watched not just by the public, but by the people who keep the institution running day to day. And that awareness has made her even more deliberate. She doesn't speak unnecessarily. She doesn't react impulsively. Every move feels intentional, as if she's already operating with the weight of the future crown in mind. What's especially telling is that no one close to her describes bitterness. Hurt, yes. Disappointment, absolutely. But not bitterness. That restraint is precisely what makes this situation so powerful. It removes the option for the palace to dismiss concerns as emotion or exaggeration. What remains is a calm, unresolved truth that refuses to disappear. Meanwhile, the distance between Catherine and Camilla hasn't closed. If anything, it has solidified into something permanent. Politeness without warmth, cooperation without trust. Staff say this isn't something that will explode later. It doesn't need to. The separation is already doing its work quietly, redefining relationships and reshaping influence. The palace can continue pretending this is manageable. That time will smooth it over. That appearances will be enough. But insiders suggest that strategy is wearing thin. The next generation of leadership won't operate the same way. And moments like this are why, because when history looks back, it won't focus on who raised their voice or who said what behind closed doors. It will focus on who was protected, who wasn't, and what the institution chose to value when it had the chance to do better. And that's why this story still matters. Not because of drama, not because of gossip, but because it revealed something the palace can't unsee, and neither can the people inside it who finally decided that staying silent felt like the